So I decided to talk about ethical considerations in in psychedelic-assisted therapy. I had a version of this presentation that was more of a kind of an overview, and I decided instead to structure it all according to the 9 how to facilitate a psychedelic session more ethically format to try to make it very practical. Okay. When I press space, nothing happens. Arrow.
That's the right arrow.
The right arrow. Okay, cool. We did it. Okay. So same at the top. I'm only going to cover a few things that need to be covered. There's a lot of things that are important, but I'm not going to talk about it all. Second thing is that I don't think there's any level of ethical guidelines or rules or like restrictions on who can practice or restrictions on who can be a journeyer that will prevent harm from happening in the space. I think if you just require more and more credentials, you'll still end up with people that are abusing people. They'll just have an LPC or an MSW or whatever, right? Okay, so our goal here is harm reduction, basically, is my point. Lastly, I'm going to be talking about sexual assault and therapy abuse, not in depth, but we are going to talk about it. Okay, what am I talking about? What is psychedelic-assisted therapy? I can't spend enough time here to cover everything that I want to cover, but I guess specifically, like, there's a lot of ways people use psychedelics to help people heal, right? And what we're talking about is a specific Western capitalist clinical context where the person is going to have some kind of like licensed medical professional type thing, mental health professional type thing, or some kind of special training, which is like a very limited like range of which these things actually happen. And I am talking about the above ground context, which in this case is like the government knows, it's endorsed it, everyone's allowed, all that kind of stuff. The underground has been doing psychedelic assisted therapy for a very long time. We even just think of the American underground, at least since the 50s or 60s. And there's a lot of knowledge there, but that's not the context that I'm talking about, trying to implement some of these ethical practices. Okay, this is this therapy structure thing that I handed out. It's a little graphic that's floating around. So in essence, what I just need you all to know about the structure of psychedelic therapy is that there's a prep session or many prep sessions, a psychedelic session, and an integration session, one or many integration sessions. Sometimes there's multiple psychedelic sessions, sometimes there's months of prep, sometimes there's just 1 or 2 prep sessions. The amount that people are using, how they're spacing the sessions, all kinds of things totally change between different ways of doing this on the above ground. But I'm going to be talking about these 3 things, so you have to know that that's what I'm talking about. Okay. Next, why do we need special ethical guidelines? I'll just read the quote first. The deeper a client moves into a state of consciousness, which has an inner or transpersonal focus, the greater the need for professionals' adherence to the ordinary ethical issues and the greater need for professional self-reflection and an ethic of care. The essence, really, why I think psychedelic therapy, which is what PAT is the abbreviation for, why we need special ethics is that there is a greater potential for harm to the client and a greater vulnerability of the client and a heightened power dynamic between the clinician and the client. And all of those things sort of exacerbate the existing issues we have with therapy abuse in this field. It's not necessarily my position that psychedelic therapy is especially prone to abuse. I think we'll find that out. I don't think we know in terms of like above ground what it's going to look like yet. I could see a world where the addition of the psychedelic, because it essentially amplifies every aspect of the therapy process, that it would also amplify problematic or inappropriate or unethical parts of the therapy process. Okay, and then the other thing is that the impact to the client of facilitating poorly is really severe. The word that I've been using is psychedelic trauma. We call it psychedelic enhanced trauma. Psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier. They can amplify a traumatic experience as it's happening. And that could be the facilitator, it could be lots of things the person is dealing with. But the impact can be a lot more long-term and acute and severe than you might expect because the person is so open when they're having that traumatic experience. Yeah. So those are reasons we need special ethical guidelines. Next, abuse in psychedelic therapy. So we've already seen instances of abuse in above ground clinical regulated psychedelic-assisted therapy. This quote, which I'll read here, a drug like MDMA may have healing properties, but it can also be intensely traumatic. It can actually make things worse. It creates a deep sense of safety, even when that safety doesn't exist. And I think there's something really dangerous about overriding innate senses of fear. This lady, Megan Gleason, reported that she was sexually assaulted during and after the phase 3 MDMA MAPS trials by her therapists. Let's see what their names. Richard Jensen and Donna Dreyer, a married opposite sex therapy team. Okay, so there are a lot of instances besides Megan's. I chose to talk about hers because all of the precautions were in place, right? And I think that's important for me to come back to that idea at the beginning of like, we can't eliminate the instances of things happening that shouldn't happen. All we can do is seek to reduce them. Yeah, and Megan talks a lot about essentially how by lowering her defenses, the MDMA made her more vulnerable to the advances of her therapists. And also potentially, as we'll talk later, might have induced the therapist to feel like things were appropriate they wouldn't otherwise have done, or things like that. Okay. So in order not to talk about therapy abuse for a whole lot more in the presentation, I'm just referring to this podcast. It's called Cover Story Power Trip. They have a second season that's like a different series on a different topic, but the first season is Cover Story Power Trip. It details a lot of abuse that's been happening in the psychedelic field. 95% of it is on the underground, right, or outside this country, but that's just because not enough of it's happened inside this country and the above ground yet. And so there are still things to be learned from all those other stories. Some things to know about this podcast. I was going back and forth about how to refer people to it. I just have two warnings. The first is that the coverage is genuinely not balanced in this story. It's taken a couple of years, but a lot of the people who were like indicted by this piece of journalism have eventually come out with their own version of things, right? I think it's important just to look at both, right? Especially since you don't really understand what the facilitator was thinking when you just hear from the person that they were facilitating for. Okay. The other thing is just that it's I found this podcast intensely traumatic to even just listen to. I listened to it in like literally like 10 to 20 minute sections over the process of several months. So be warned. Okay. Next, okay, now we're on that little sheet of all the little rules. The first one is about consent. And we're actually going to spend the majority of this presentation talking about the first one. And the issue, okay, so here's the essential issue. You have these preparation sessions where the client is sober, and then these psychedelic sessions when the client is not sober, right? And when the client is not sober, they cannot fully consent to things that would otherwise they would be able to consent to, right? Which is a huge problem. We're talking about the ethics of being a psychedelic facilitator, right? The best solution that I have for this is that during the preparation sessions, you have very extensive, abnormally extensive conversations with clients about everything that might arise during the psychedelic session, everything that you can predict, or everything that's common. And what you do is when you're in the psychedelic session, you follow the guidelines and boundaries established in the prep session, right? Unless the client during the session is requesting less contact, right? So if, let's say in the prep session, they agree to hand holding or something, you're in the psychedelic session, you have an intuition that maybe hand holding is appropriate, you ask to see if that's appropriate, if that's what the person wants, and they say no, right? Obviously you respect that new boundary, even though the no happened while they were doing psychedelics. So we're trending towards less contact around those boundaries. And I'll make clear later, but that contact I really think of in terms of not just physical touch, but like energetic touch and talking and changing the music without asking and all kinds of stuff like that. Like those are interventions, right? That are happening in the space that need to have consent based around them. Okay, this is the last piece. So there are inevitably a bunch of things that you either can't predict or that the client is going to have to consent to while they're on psychedelics, right? And that's a gray area here. So for instance, one of them would be like, if as we'll talk later, if you're doing two-stage dosing, right? The client has to decide if they want a booster after they're already on psychedelics, right? So even if you inform the client that that's going to be an option for their high, right? By the time you're actually asking for that consent about whether to do more or less psychedelics, right? That person is altered. And so to some degree, we have to rely on that. I think the key to success in those moments is one, to be very clear and communicative with people, right? To assume that like you've informed them well in the preparation doesn't mean you have, to assume that they can understand even when they're altered the pros and cons of that decision, right? About like a booster, for instance, right? So they'll say something like, I don't know how I feel. And you can ask them to check in with themselves. And you can also give them the information of like, it will take you deeper, right? You'll be deeper for a little bit longer. Like there are things you can say, right? That help them make those decisions. I think also importantly, it places the autonomy back onto the client, right? So I'm constantly asking them what they want and asking them what they need, right? And I think that gives the impression over time that I'm not in charge, actually, which is true. So, okay, next. Informed consent. So obviously, consent doesn't really mean much. The person doesn't understand what they're consenting to. And there are some things in psychedelic therapy that are very hard to inform people about. One of the major ones is, how can someone who's never had a psychedelic experience consent to having a psychedelic experience, right? How can I even explain in words to someone who's never had a psychedelic experience what a psychedelic experience is like, much less what their psychedelic experience would be like? And so, yeah, the psychedelic experiences are ineffable in that sense. They can't really be put into words. And that's a problem. The second problem is that the psychedelic experiences are totally idiosyncratic. They're unique to people. And this is a quote from me. You never know. Yeah, you never know how a psychedelic experience is going to go. And if you think you know, if you think you've mastered the psychedelic, you're about to be proven wrong.
True. Great quote.
So what I've learned over and over again is just that you really can't assume. Like there are so many factors in place about how a specific psychedelic experience is going to go. I think a lot of effort being done in the field right now is to try to make these things like predictable and controllable. And I actually think that's like a misunderstanding of what this is. So, what I wrote here, so just some examples, which depends on the drug education in the world, but I know that people can have DMT level visuals on MDMA, right? I know people can visit other dimensions on cannabis. I know people can take 5 grams of mushrooms and not notice, right? And I know people can take half a gram of mushrooms and be God, right? So like everything is possible. And when people come as experts and they say, oh, I know, like giving you 2 grams of mushrooms means you'll have this experience, right? Those people are lost in their own sense of like ego and control, which they don't have. Yeah. So the question then becomes, if the client doesn't know what's going to happen, and if I don't know what's going to happen, then how can anyone have informed consent going into a psychedelic experience, right? Okay, so things to cover for informed consent, and we're not going to cover all of this, and this isn't even like a complete list of the things that I think have to be covered. If you look back at the therapy structure graphic, I actually have like a pre-preparation session that's just information and informed consent, right? And that's because I found that the amount of content that needs to be covered just on this alone is at least an hour worth of content to talk to somebody about. Okay, first thing, what is a psychedelic experience like? I think the most reliable thing here actually is to refer them to a past client with a similar history and background, right? So if someone else hasn't tripped, or like they've tripped with you or they tripped with someone else, but before that they had never done it before, right? And let's say they're similarly like from a rural town and they have similar demographics, like that person, when they describe what being on mushrooms is like, is going to be the most helpful to that client, the more like overlap they have in their experience. And I say that because I've seen people try to explain psychedelic experiences in a lot of ways, right? And truthfully, it's just all over the place. You know, you have like the really refined people like Alan Watts, right? Or Terrence McKenna, who are like really trying to articulately describe that state. But that's not even necessarily going to be the most helpful thing to a lot of people whose first time is, you know, they haven't done any psychedelics in 40 years and they're like looking to come to terms with their cancer diagnosis. Like it's not going to be the frame for them, right? So I think finding that for other people can be really helpful and something that the above ground affords us the ability to do, which is huge. The other thing is like popular media. We've seen like a rise in like books and TV shows and movies that are specifically aimed at novices, lay people, right? I think you should look at those. Anything you're going to refer your clients to, you should look at yourself to make sure that it reflects what you want your client to think. Because there's just a lot of stuff out there and a lot of different ways people are talking about it. And it definitely can like, it can kind of ruin your client if you give them access to stuff that has like the wrong perspective, right? So like, if you give them enough stories of like miraculous healing with no effort, that will potentially harm your actual therapeutic progress. Okay, also, there are like basic things that are common, I'd say common experiences. And I want to emphasize common because every single thing that I'm talking about here, I have seen exceptions, right? And I don't think they're edge cases. I think that it's normal that people are unusual. So this is something I'll often show people during preparation sessions. This is just a way to talk about the progress and course of the psychedelic journey, right? I gave out this in its own little graphic too. But the main reason I like to talk about it is because, so as you'll see, right, there's the ingestion of the thing, right? And then there's some amount of time before the onset, which is something a lot of people don't think about, right? And for some things like psilocybin, that can be 45 minutes to 2 hours, right? They have consumed it and now they're waiting to see what happens, right? And it's been my experience that this is the most psychologically difficult time, actually. And there's a lot that a good facilitator can do to help make that time useful in setting the person's nervous system up for success. Okay, and then after it onsets, there is a significant increase in psychedelic energy on the way to the peak. That's called the come up, right? Then there's the peak, a long period of slowly decreasing intensity, which is called the plateau, and then the come down. Now, this has now given me a bunch of words that I can use to talk to someone that has no idea what I'm talking about parts of the experience, right? So for instance, I could say something like, many people on psilocybin experience nausea during the come up, right? That's true, right? Many people on cannabis experience anxiety on the come up, right? Many people on MDMA will experience all kinds of intense energies, like they want to run around or like escape their body when they're on MDMA, right? Like, so you can give people these like generalities that help them understand the course of the experience. And also while they're on the thing, you can even, so the person could like sit up and they could say, like, how am I doing? Right. And I could say, okay, you're on the come down, or like, I know where you are from like the timing and how you're interacting and stuff like that. I can inform you that you're not about to start going back to the peak, right? Now, truthfully, there are still exceptions to this, right? And like, there are people, especially in what I've seen more is like in a recreational context or doing music festivals and stuff. I've seen people peak like 5 or 6 times, right? And there's times in the middle where you think they're completely out of it and they're completely sober, and now they're way back to 11, right? So yeah, nothing is consistent.
What about ketamine?
Ketamine, so it depends how you administer it. Intramuscular ketamine is the timing that I have here. This is incredibly consistent. From what I can tell.
Something to look for.
So what I usually see for come up on like an IM ketamine, especially in my personal experience, is actually something akin to like a deep out breath. There's like a meditative relaxation piece of it. But of course, not everyone has that experience. And people do have like hell realm ketamine experiences that are awful from the moment they start. Yeah, so, yeah. What is kind of consistent, and I'd say, like, unless there's some genetic differences in how you metabolize things like that, but especially IM ketamine, in terms of coming out of it at about 50 minutes after the injection, it's surprisingly consistent, enough that the clinic that I go to, like, can base their whole schedule off of everyone being able to walk at an hour. Anyway, okay. So every psychedelic journey is different. Oh wait, no, this is what I want to talk about, therapy protocol. I think that in the informed consent, you should be describing your therapy protocol as completely as you possibly can. This, I guess, sounds kind of obvious, but I guess something I've seen since especially coming to Boulder is that this is actually like not a practice of a lot of, especially underground practitioners, and they feel that there's some clinical benefit to keeping clients in the dark about what they're giving them, how much they're giving them, how long the sessions are. And I don't know why, but I think from an ethics perspective, that's a no-go, right? They should know as much as you can reasonably give them inside of that informational period, including like, at 45 minutes, I'll make a booster available, and that booster will be 1/3 of your initial dose. And if you choose it, great. If you don't, no problem. Covering as many of those things. And there's so many things to cover, right? There's the space, there's the music, there's the what do we do if, right? There's contingency, emergency plans, there's like all kinds of things to talk about. The last thing I'm going to cover on this slide, just because we won't have enough time to cover everything otherwise, is that I really think it's important throughout the whole thing that you emphasize, as I've been emphasizing, that every psychedelic journey is different and you can't speak authoritatively about what is going to happen. And I actually feel like from more of, I guess, a spiritual perspective, that you're like testing the psychedelic when you act that way, when you pretend that you know and project that kind of confidence. Again, I think it's about to prove you wrong. Anyway, okay. Next, navigating touch, right? So inside of psychedelic therapy, it's widely accepted that some level of physical contact is going to be like part of the protocol. And I think that's because like a well-placed hand holding is like an immensely powerful therapeutic tool. But there's lots of issues with that. In fact, I think that's, if anything, that's like what brings in the most amount of like gray area and risk for practitioners, right? Is any instance where you're making physical contact with them. So how do we do this in a way that's better? Okay, so the first is the thorough consent conversations. So that touch consent worksheet that I handed out, that covers basically, if you go through it with a client, it systematically covers with them a conversation involving all of the ways in which you might be comfortable making contact, they might be comfortable receiving contact, right? And also negotiating those boundaries between them. So the beginning of the chart is this like body map, and it's covering areas. So the areas in green are areas that I'm often comfortable making contact with, right? So a hand hold, a hand on the shoulder, hand on the upper back if the person needs help sitting up, right? That's the only situation really that I probably do that. And so we'll cover that, right? And I'll cover what I mean by those types of touch, right? So when I say shoulders, I don't mean a shoulder massage, right? Like there are different kinds of contact and you have to have all those types of conversations. And you can go over it with them and they can say, actually, I don't want my shoulders touched, or my back is a weird place for me, or anything like that. And you can cut them, you can cross them out on the sheet and put it in the notes at the end of the worksheet. Like the worksheet is designed specifically to help facilitate that conversation. Okay. The next thing, okay, so this is still on the touch consent sheet. See if I can remember. Oh, I have it right here. I have notes. Okay. Okay. Oh, also, this is something important with the body map. I found it really helpful. So if you just go to someone and you say, like, how do you feel about hand holding? Like that, there's not a lot to work off there, right? If you sit with the person and have them imagine the various kinds of contact and then check in with themselves about whether that feels safe and supportive, that's a much more productive way to get those types of preferences and answers out of people. Next thing, and I call this the no game. So it is difficult to say no all the time, but especially to your clinician who you've been trusted with your mental health in a moment in a space when you feel vulnerable. And so during the preparation sessions, we practice them telling me no. So we'll start, usually I have it time limited, so I'll say for like 10 minutes. This will be after we did the touch consent worksheet. I'll be like, for the next 10 minutes, like if I ask to make any kind of contact with you, I need you to say no. That's it, right? And I'll only ask to do the kinds of contact that we've like agreed to and stuff, and I'm not going to do any of them anyway, right? So I'll say like, we'll just be like in the middle of the conversation, I'll be like, can I hold your hand, right? And they're supposed to say no, right? And if they forget to say no, I'll remind them, and then we keep playing, right? What you then find inevitably, I'd say with almost everybody, is they come in contact with their resistance to telling me no, right? And they get to see me handle receiving a no well, right? And I think both of those things help to re-entrain that, right? There are instances where we played the game like 4 or 5 times over several prep sessions, and they just really are uncomfortable with the no, right? And then that tells me that we shouldn't have physical touch be a part of the session in any way, right? Because if they can't say no, then even their yes in session is not helpful to me, right? Okay, and then also it's important to like avoid forms of touch that you're not trained in. I suspect that when they're training like psilocybin facilitators, hand holding is going to be like something they actually train you as part of, but I don't really know what they're going to do. No one is doing this, just to be clear. Like all this stuff is stuff that I think needs to happen. Yeah, I think it's going to start shifting over time. I think we're going to have to. Okay. The next thing, and I said this a bunch of times, we're going to have something you got to verify. Like even if you have all these things set up in the preparation sessions, right? Before you do anything in the psychedelic session, right? Any kind of intervention, you need to ask the person if that's what they want and if that's appropriate. You have to get that consent again. Exceptions again are for like physical emergencies, right? The person tries to like jump out the window or is falling, or there's lots of things that could happen. And even in those cases, I think the facilitator should announce what they're doing and why as it's happening, with the assumption, especially for like falling or like someone doing something like that, that they're probably in somewhat of a delirious place, right? And so it's helpful to be like, this is, you're here, this is now, I'm me, this is why we've made contact. Okay. Next thing, you should always provide alternatives. Even if the person declines, if they're like, I love touch, there's no way that when I'm in session, I'm not going to want physical touch, you should still provide alternatives to touch. And that's because they might change their mind, right? And you can't respect that boundary. You don't have alternatives. Well, you can, but you're going to end up in situations where the person is reaching out and they want to be touched. They want that touch because they want that connection, right? And the denial of that connection can be anti-therapeutic, right? And so if, for instance, let's just say you're not comfortable with touch at that moment, or it's some kind of touch that they haven't agreed they didn't want in the beginning, or there's all kinds of things, right? So yeah, touch doesn't have to happen at all. That's an important thing to remember. Alternatives to touch: energetic contact, imagined self-touch, pillows, stuffed animals, therapy animals, warm water bottle. There's a lot of possible options for creating like pressure and warmth for that person on some given spot that isn't you physically touching them. Okay, great. We made the second one. Okay, so start low and go slow. This is a common harm reduction principle that I'm a big fan of. But inside of psychedelic therapy, like what do I mean by that? As I said before, it's impossible to know what's like a specific person's going to be like on a psychedelic. I'd say especially if they've never taken a psychedelic before, it's been a long time. How that particular body reacts to this particular substance is just not something you're going to know going in. And so one of the best ways to make sure that you don't give someone too much or too big of an experience or traumatic experience is to start low and go slow. Two-stage dosing is something that I think is an important part of any medicine practice, maybe with the exception of like cannabis, or like there's some maybe exceptions, but for the most part, ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, we're all doing two-stage dosing. And this is being practiced, not everywhere, but for the most part. Okay, so for a number of reasons, it may be advisable to split up dosing during psychedelic sessions into two stages. The first dose is often the larger one and given after the invocation. The second dose is generally given once the first dose has taken effect, if the client voices that they want more. So in this example, there's the invocation. They get the first dose, which is 2 grams of psilocybin. We wait for it to kick in, right? And then we ask if we want the second dose. If we want the second dose, we give them the second dose, 1 gram of psilocybin, right?
Is that typically during the plateau phase or?
Right, okay. So for psilocybin, for instance, what you would be doing is you give initially at the ingestion, right? You'd wait for it to onset and you would offer a booster like right here. And the reason you offer the booster right here is that if you offer it by the time they hit the peak, you're going to add about 2 hours to the end of the session, especially with psilocybin. And so the other thing is the come up is often a very difficult, like people are often just in the middle of experiencing some like intense sensations and like nausea and difficulty and stuff, right? And so if the person wants more here, they probably want more, right? If the person wants more like down here, right, they're really just like hoping to get back to the peak, right? And so if you gave it here, they would basically just like peak out here and then the come down would be at the end. And so
interesting because people have no idea what the content is gonna hold.
Exactly. So all they're making a decision about is like how deep they're willing to go in the psilocybin, right? And they still don't know. Like if we want to give it a percentage or something, like someone's never tripped before, the knowledge that they have at time 0 versus the knowledge they have like right around here is only like 10, 15% more.
Yeah,
You know
so
what I mean?
is that even ethical?
Well, this, it's a good question with this like second dose because they have to make that decision. You know what I mean? And I mean, it goes back and forth. I think for me, here's the risk. So if you start with the full 3 grams up at the front, right? Then you get to find out together whether that was too much, right? If you start here and then continue forward, right? Then there's this moment where they can say no if it's already intense, right? And then they write out the 2 grams, right? Or they can say yes and go deeper, which gives them more autonomy and control, right? But the question really, and I don't have a good answer for this, is like they are altered during that second decision, right? And like it could happen that the person, like because they're altered, says yes when they wouldn't have said yes, or yeah, there's lots of possibilities, right?
Yeah, and specifically for the case of someone who's never done it before.
Exactly.
It's like negligible whether or not.
I see. I don't think so. I actually, if someone's never done it before, I think the amount they know after around here is a lot, actually, comparatively. Yeah, because they have no idea, right? Like they could see like how close is psilocybin to being really drunk,
Right.
right? That could be the
Right.
question,
Yeah.
right? And what they know 45 minutes after 2 grams of psilocybin compared to what they knew before is much higher, I think.
They still never tripped in their lives.
Exactly, right. And it's like, and there is a dimension to which like because no one knows what's going to happen, there isn't a dimension of which it's like we're all just guessing and hoping. And as a facilitator, you're like trying to create a space that's safe for a lot of different things to happen, right? So even if it is like too much, right? Hopefully you're able to help move them to that experience so that it isn't traumatic, right? But you could end up in a situation where like, yeah, it was a more intense experience than you wanted, which actually is why the second thing, and it's something that isn't being practiced and it's a financial issue. I think you should have psychedelic test sessions, right? So I think especially for someone it's their first time, right? You have a session where the highest dose you're going to go to at the end is like 1 gram, which is usually a threshold dose for most people, right? You still offer them 0.5 gram to begin with so they can boost it if they want, right? And you have an entire 6-hour session where the person probably doesn't even have a full psychedelic experience, right? But they might, right, have a full psychedelic experience. And at the very least, unless they're very tolerant to the mushrooms or to whatever you're giving them, you can do psycholytic therapy for that 6-hour period, right? You can get stuff done that's more effective because they're a little bit altered. The real thing you're gaining though is this major X factor, right? Of like, they have no idea what they're about to do. The first time you're ever going to give this person psychedelics, they've never tripped before. It's actually totally their first time, right? And you want to do like a full psychedelic dose. That's a very dicey decision because you just really have no idea, right? Especially in a clinical context where you're working with people that are unwell in the status quo, right? Not people who are like, I'm looking to expand myself, but people who are like, I'm looking to be able to work, right? I think the psychedelic test sessions is a huge thing. The problem really is that it's incredibly expensive to get psychedelic therapy, right? And you like that one psychedelic test session would easily be like $800, $1,000, $1,200, right? And when you sell it, is like it's just because I want to be careful and know what you need. Like people are willing to like take that risk to not pay the $1,200. So there's like a problem there. I also think one of the real benefits of the psychedelic test sessions, is there's a large part of like the anxiety during the initial ingestion through the come up is a fear of the unknown, right? Whether you've tripped before or not, like especially if you trip before, you don't know what's going to happen, right? So like there's a certain anxiety that they're carrying into that experience. And for some people, especially people who have saved their first time psychedelics until they were in the presence of a licensed mental health professional, they're going to experience a lot of anxiety before the experience and right after they take the psychedelic. And if what you gave them was like 0.5 gram of mushrooms or 1/4 gram of mushrooms, right? You can work with that anxiety and they're never going to have to actually be in a full psychedelic state while you work with that anxiety, right? And so that's another benefit of the test sessions is sometimes I'm actually kind of convinced you could do test sessions where you give the person nothing and you can just work with the anxiety that they feel about what they think's about to happen. Yeah. I mean, you should probably tell them that, but okay. Okay, so also just going to mention, because I'm not going to talk about it at the end, I don't think. There's a tendency, especially in the underground community, with psilocybin, for what I would consider to be massive doses for first timers even. We're talking like 7, 10, 12 grams of mushrooms as being like the required amount. Like there's a lower amount is like not therapeutic. Which is something that kind of emerged, I think, from like Erowid and Reddit in like the 2000s about like heroic doses being anyway. And for whether that works for anyone, I think it's fair to say that it's not trauma informed to do that. And oftentimes when I talk to other people that are planning to go into other versions of this business, they regard me as very conservative in the amount that I administer. Okay, so always verify consent. I've already talked about it, but it is really important. You always got to verify consent, even while you're in the session, continually with the person to see if that's something that they want. Obviously, exceptions being emergencies and things where you can't ask, but you inform, right? When you can't ask, you inform. Okay, this one is a major one that I've just learned over and over again. When in doubt, stay out of the way, right? There are at least 5 experts, including you, in the room when you're facilitating on psychedelics. There's you and all your clinical experience and knowledge and experience and wisdom and all that. And really your intuition and nervous system, I'd say, is what's really showing up. There's the client and their inner wisdom, their inner healer, their psyche, whatever you want to say. There's the psychedelic and all the wisdom that comes with that. There's the music, the musician, and all those types of things. And then there's all of the energetic presences, your ancestors, your guide, spirits in the room, all kinds of things. So there's probably a lot more than 5 experts. And when you are in a spot where, let's say the client is very quiet and you're not sure what to do next, right? Stay out of the way, right? Like there are 4 other experts that are enacting a process, and it's easier than you would imagine to interrupt that process instead of enhance it. And so, yeah, when in doubt, stay out of the way. Next, okay, this one, I'm not even exactly sure how I'm going to totally talk about this one. I guess the first thing to say is that when a person is on a psychedelic and the client is on a psychedelic, it expands a lot of their sort of like the aperture of their like energy. Energy like moves out and in and around them faster and more aggressively than it would otherwise, right? And if anyone in the space that is even marginally attuned will feel that energy, whether they acknowledge that that's what's happening to them or not. And so I guess the first thing to mention is that even when the facilitator doesn't take any psychedelics, psychedelic facilitation is an altered state of consciousness. And you don't have to be aware of it. I've seen practitioners that aren't aware of it. I'm convinced that it is an ethical issue to become aware of it because of how much of a difference it makes in outcomes in the space. So what am I doing when I'm in the room? So there's me, there's the client, there's the room itself, there's the music playing, there's incense if there's incense, there's whether the window is open or not, there's all kinds of things happening, right? And I am staying mindfully aware of all of those channels simultaneously, right? And the main thing that I'm focusing on, let's say maybe 90% of my focus is actually on me and my nervous system, right? And the reason it's on me and my nervous system is because 1, I don't want to become overly enmeshed with my client for many reasons. And 2, most of the information about what's happening in the client's nervous system is in my nervous system, right? And so I'm mostly paying attention to myself. And what will happen, I'm maybe, let's say, 5% attuned to the client, right? And there'll be these moments of like transference and countertransference. They'll just like happen, right? Where the client will be totally silent, but I can feel a pain in my heart, right? And so I will then move that energy through me and out through my feet into the ground, or through me and out into the altar space if we made one, or something along those lines, right? And so actually I'm spending a lot of time processing my own energy, right? Which is actually mostly transferred energy from my client anyway. And that like 90%, 5% is just what works for me. And in fact, it's constantly negotiated, right? And the reason so, I'm attached to my energy to not merge and all that kind of stuff. I'm attuned to the client because, well, one, that's like a large part of the therapeutic benefit is my attunement, but also a lot of the psychedelic session is silent. Like people aren't saying things most of the time. And like, in order to not interrupt their process and accentuate it without them talking to you, you have to be intuitively attuned to their nervous system and what's happening for them. And those intuitions will come out as long as you're somewhat attuned to their nervous system. The problem is the more attuned you get, you eventually risk merging with their nervous system. If you merge with their nervous system, then whatever experience they're having will be your experience too. So if they're panicked, you're panicked, right? And then there's nobody to ground anybody in this space, right? The other thing is that, and I think you'll see if you listen to the Cover Story podcast, that projected energy can actually induce facilitators to feel and act in ways that they would not otherwise enjoy. And if you are not paying attention to making sure that your energy is protected and that your energy is separate from whatever's going on, then whatever sort of, I almost think of it as like an energetic psychodrama. Like the client could go through like an abuse scenario in their own, they could be excising that, right? And part of that energy that comes out is the energy of the abuser that abused them, right? And if you're not paying attention, you can catch that and have sudden impulses to do things that their abuser did, but it's not anything that you would identify with, right? Again, psychedelic facilitation is an altered state of consciousness, right? And you have to be aware of that while you're going into it because those types of things happen. And if you don't have good energetic boundaries, that's really where transference happens that you don't notice. And then it slips through and you do things or feel things or things happen that are unexpected. And then sometimes those things are unethical, right? Okay, so that's why you have to stay separated. Also, yeah, I think this is hard to explain from the outside, but when I'm paying attention to myself and I'm paying attention to the client, and I also pay attention to all these other things out in the space and all that kind of stuff, and I'm balancing between those, that's like a deep meditative practice, right? Is that sometimes, like, let's say they're having a big experience, I'll go down to 1%, right? Let's say that they're really quiet, I really don't know what's going on, I'll go up to 10%, right? Like I'll like adjust that level of contact depending on the situation. And I think that's like mostly like a mindfulness practice, but also when I'm doing it really well, what I decide to do, and I always ask, but like what I decide might be something worth asking to do, comes from a place of intuition. When a lot of people would say divine guidance, right? That there's a best version of yourself that can guide those experiences intuitively and somatically. And the less resistance you have towards it, the better in terms of giving clients. You'll end up with situations where the clients are like, I don't know how you knew that that's what I needed to hear at that moment, but it's exactly what I need to hear at that moment, right? Like that's how those things happen, right? Is intuitive awareness. The danger there, obviously, is you just act out of intuition and then you intuitively act on transferred energy and you do something inappropriate, right? So you still, and this is also mindfulness practice, have to run all of the intuitions through these ethical frameworks of like what's appropriate and what did we talk about in preparation. Okay, psychedelic power dynamic. We're a little late on this, so I'll just keep going real fast. Just like with regular therapy and psychedelic, or regular therapy, there's a dynamic between the therapist and the client where the therapist has all this power and there's an assumption that the therapist kind of knows. That's even higher in a psychedelic situation. So to begin with, when a client comes to you, they're completely entrusting you with their mental health. They might not even appreciate how much they're entrusting you with their mental health, but they really are. And in order to do that, they probably have already projected onto you unusual knowledge or wisdom or magical powers or like all kinds of things, right? And so from the beginning, the power is imbalanced, right? Which is one of the reasons I'm always like putting autonomy back onto clients, right? Because the more you consult them, the more they realize that what they think matters, right? The other thing is that if you do the work well, you will facilitate for people completely new, spiritually significant, non-ordinary transformative experiences. And it is very easy for them to ascribe that transformation to you as a person, right? And that's, I think, very dangerous as like a dynamic, because that person from then on would do whatever you told them to, really, because you're their guru, right? You're like, you've risen to a status beyond what a normal person would be, right? Because you've demonstrated your gifts. And so in terms of the dynamic, I don't think that at any point you could have a sexual relationship with someone that you had a psychedelic session that you facilitated for. The ACA has like a 5-year recommendation for former clients. I think it's a never recommendation for psychedelic therapy. And again, it's just because like you've touched their soul. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. Yeah. Next, maintain humility. Okay, what do I mean by this? So I definitely don't mean the version of maintaining humility where you like can't admit that you're good at your job, right? Or can't say that you have skills. I think that you should aim to be accurate about how good you are at these things or not. The kind of humility that I'm talking about is about that taking personal credit for a client's transformation, right? So, and really, I just think it's just like false, right? Like you can say like, yeah, I facilitated a really good session there, right? But there were 4 other experts in the room, right? And if the client's giving you credit for a long-term transformation, like if the client is still well a year later, right? That was like 95% the client, right? Like, and so I think those things are both important with like maintaining humility moving forward. I also think that this shows up in the most toxic way, in kind of the classic form of like therapist-client, where throughout the whole thing, the facilitator has this kind of like, I know better attitude towards the client, right? And like, I have this like deep wisdom, or I have this thing, and like, you don't know. And kind of like they start acting like MDs, basically. And it creates problems, I think, in that space. Because again, it's not like you as a facilitator don't have mastery over your tools like that, right? To pretend that you like can reach into someone's soul and fix them. Yeah. Okay. Participating community. So this is something I'm really looking forward to changing when things go above ground. I think that if you listen to the Cover Story podcast, I think a lot of the things that happened, especially the weird things that happened, were in part the result of isolation on the part of the facilitators, right? They're committing an illegal activity, right? The only people around them are community members that probably they worked with, lots of dual relationships in the underground. And so they're kind of in this like godlike status. And when you're in that place, your shadow starts to leak out and like do weird things. And if there's no one there to call you on it, right, it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder. And eventually when it finally comes to light, even if it was, even if you were doing consent well and stuff, it's just gone too far afield. Like nobody's okay with whatever you were up to. At the end on the back of the 1 through 9 thing, I have these 2 videos at the bottom. I'm not going to talk about him more than this, but about this facilitator named Martin Ball. And I think he's a really good example of someone who was in isolation long enough that what he started to do just got too weird for anyone to stomach, basically. And he actually has stopped practicing after Cover Story came out. Yeah. Okay. The other thing is I think we need new systems of accountability. I think the way like the punitive rule following stuff that goes with DORA and all that is toxic to actually preventing abuse. And the reason is because I think you need restorative justice frameworks that feel like they give justice to the degree that facilitators will self-report potential unethical behavior. And as long as it's not the case, as long as it's the case that a facilitator or a therapist will like take it to their grave unless somebody grieves them, right, there will be more harm done, right? And I don't know how to balance that with actually getting rid of facilitators that need to be gotten rid of, right? That's probably the biggest candidate of this presentation, is that I don't know, but I think we need new, probably like local accountability networks. I also think that unlike regular talk therapy, that with psychedelic therapy, supervision and mentorship is for your whole life. And it's like part of the practice to be like a piece of a psychedelic healing community, right? To be constantly checking yourself and being checked by other people about what you do and how you behave and all those types of things. So isolation is dangerous. Okay. Nice. Okay, last thing, which will leave 10 minutes for questions, which is great. Okay, So I think one of the major issues with, like, for instance, listening to cover story or like hearing about abuse in the psychedelic space or whatever, is that the assumption is that I am not the sort of person who would do something like that, right? Like when you hear that story, right? And I think that discourages the kind of self-reflection that's actually necessary to prevent doing harm to people. So I think you should always assume that at any moment you have the capacity to cause harm to your client, regardless of your identities or your history or even what's happening in that moment. I think you should always have that assumption because it's always true. There's always a possibility. There's certainly people in like the therapy world or in psychedelic therapy world that are like bad actors that are causing a lot more of the abuse than is necessary, you know, or than is their share or whatever. But I think most of the time, like when you listen to cover story and you listen to the reports of the facilitators that talk about it, you know, that were accused of things, they're always convinced that they were helping the client and that they were in it for the right reasons and they really meant the best and this was their intentions, et cetera, right? I think, I don't know the percentage, but I think it's the majority of therapy abusers and abuse in general is happening from people who, when they were first told not to abuse clients, thought the conversation was dumb because they would never do that, right? And so, for instance, when you're listening to something like cover story, right? I think it's important to like look up what the facilitators have to say and to try to understand how you could do the same thing, right? Even if it's like something that doesn't make any sense to you, that do your absolute best to imagine where are your weaknesses, where are things that would lead you to act in ways that you don't agree with. Yeah, and then actually I just remembered I skipped a part, but I'll cover just real fast, which is on dealing with energy. I mentioned personal energetic hygiene, which I realize is a weird word. You might not know what I mean. You can not only carry energy out of session that affects your mental health, you can carry energy out of session that you bring into future therapy sessions with clients. And so both to maintain your own ability to function in the field and to protect clients from undue energetic influences, I think it's important to find ways to clear energy. Right now, regardless of your like theological worldview or your perspective of any of that stuff, it's just about finding things that work for you, finding things that are shared in your client's worldview, right, and using those things. So an example would be like, if we were going to do a psychedelic session in this room, right, we'd sage the whole place, right, to begin with. And then when the whole thing ended, we'd sage the whole place again, right? It's like, just like sweeping, right? Like you are doing basic things to try to protect your energy or other people's energy in the space. Another thing that's been really helpful, I would say most of my time in Naropa has been about trying to figure out this particular piece, right? So I've gained a lot of different skills to try to maintain my personal protection. I have like necklaces and objects that I'll like bring with me that help keep me grounded, keep my energy protected. I'll do this thing where I sort of imagine a golden light shield between me and the client that will be like more or less opaque depending on what amount of contact I'm trying to make. That kind of helps. I think also what's been surprisingly useful, I'll take a shower that goes over the crown of my head right after a session with people. And while I'm doing that, I'll add this like it's kind of like a forgiveness prayer, or forgive them for any impact they've had on me, forgive me for any effect they've had on them, like that kind of thing. And I found that to be really helpful, but everyone's got to figure out their own thing there. And that's the whole presentation. You have 4 minutes for question and answer? Yeah. And I'm asking questions. Yeah.
How do you feel about the fact with MDMA, the second boost is more during that plateau period?
Yeah, you know, especially with MDMA, it's a weird one. So first of all, I don't think MDMA boosts very well, actually. And like the first dose that you get with MDMA is the most effective one for most people most of the time. My perception from the outside is that what they're actually looking to do is not increase the height of the peak, but increase the length of the plateau.
I think that's usually how it's discussed.
Exactly, and I think that kind of works because I don't think MDMA specifically, and that's a more complicated neurochemical conversation, but like MDMA specifically doesn't, like the first peak is kind of the only peak for the night with MDMA, which is not true of psilocybin or ketamine. Those medicines redose more easily.
You find that there are like certain psychedelics that facilitate healing for certain traumas,
Mhm.
like sexual trauma. You would guide maybe someone toward MDMA or better ketamine use.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it is kind of individualized, and I'm confident that in the long run, the clinics are going to have very individualized protocols and stuff. What I would say, I don't have anything for any particular issues. For me, it's like a nervous system thing, right? So, like for instance, people that are far enough through into their trauma response that they're like dead and dissociated, right? Higher energy psychedelics can be a better use for them, right? So for instance, like psilocybin in that kind of state can be an appropriate thing. So that would be someone who's like, I'm depressed, I can't get out of bed, I can't function. They're in a low energy state, right? For someone that is, let's say, PTSD, right, or something high energy, right? Psilocybin is not a great choice, especially on its own, right? Because psilocybin has a tendency to be a very high energy experience, right? And so if I was going to use it for someone in that situation, we'd be doing test sessions, we'd be going to really low doses, and more realistically, we'd be using MDMA. And the reason is because MDMA is going to expand their window of tolerance such that they can handle a high surge of psychedelic energy in a way they wouldn't be able to otherwise. Ketamine, similarly, I don't think ketamine has the same benefit for trauma in the sense of like neurochemically decreasing the trauma response, but it's definitely psychologically safe in a similar way to MDMA, where like we're safer, where it's less common that people have really psychologically challenging ketamine experiences than they would with, say, MDMA or psilocybin or cannabis. Cannabis is another example of one where for some people it can be very relaxing, and for some people it can be very high energy, intense to experience. And so you have to, yeah. So I would say that's the biggest thing is like starting low, going slow, and knowing that some medicines are more equipped to help people that are more fragile, I should say, or even just like level of stability, because that's kind of what I look for, right? Is like, how are they functioning now? You know, and do we want to expand that state right now? Because psilocybin will expand that state no matter where we go. Yeah. I think we might be out of time.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, Brendan, I have to say, thank you so much for doing this work.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, this is the work we need in the West in industrialized societies to like, this is so informed by this culture. And like you are doing this work to make this medicine work here. And so I just thank you so much for bringing your personal lens and all the study that you've done to make this presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.